Huh? I always fail to record the Zooms on those things that I do, which is like, I don't know, maybe I just want everything to be ephemeral.
Yeah,
Anyway,
exactly.
so this is actually how to introduce it. So this is going to be on everyday analysis. I mean, I guess we have had some great podcasts so far, not by us, but we have had a very interesting analysis of little hands. And then I was just thinking the other day, well, we should just have some conversations with people we like and release them because why not? But also, I don't want to get into like a proper schedule of like, I'm committed to once a week because yeah, then you become a slave to like the schedule you arbitrarily do for yourself. But yeah, anyway, so I'm here today with Katherine Everitt. Hello.
Hey, Helen, it's so good to be here. As a dear friend, as a colleague, always nice to chat and to be part of this like everyday analysis podcast. Huge honor. I love what you and Alfie are doing, and I'm so excited to talk about space and its
Yeah.
emancipatory potentiality.
Yeah, amazing. So Katherine came, when was it? Like a few months ago, right? To
Mhm.
London to give a talk at King's about her work on space. And I thought your talk was like brilliant. And I've been, ruminating as one does. Do you ever, I get this sort of like, this is so stupid. And it probably is like the most like bad faith nonsense, but often in the morning, in the sort of twilight, the nether zone between the sleep and awake, suddenly I have these like ideas, which at the time seem like, oh my God, I've like thought it all through and it all makes sense to me. Oh my God. And it's probably like, this is the equivalent of like being on LSD and thinking like, I'm going to learn how to play the cello, and then actually being like, what a stupid idea. Like it all becomes clear. And then an hour later, when you're actually awake, you're like, what was that? And it's probably like the limited consciousness that actually makes it seem like a profound thought, but it actually isn't. Although I don't know, but it's like it's always the Hegel thoughts that come at that time in the morning of like, oh my God, now I totally get what she was saying, and this really relates to this, this, and this, and we have to have a podcast conversation about it. So probably in reality, it'll be not as great as on my side as I sort of thought that like the ideas were that I had at 7 a.m. last week.
No, no, I think that's our job, right? Is to make connections where there seems to not be any connection
Yeah.
at all, right? And I think
Yeah.
often like the best thinkers in our field are the ones that can draw disparate connections between two unrelated items. And it does often come to us at 5 in the morning or when we least expect it, when we're like watching a TV show and we think, wait a minute, that's a gem right there that I
Yeah.
can pick up. But there's some optimism in this, right? That we can make connections across so many different fields. And hopefully things stick. But I'm glad that we're experimenting right now in like the podcast format is so nice for this to see what does coalesce, what does stick together. And so, yeah, we're gonna
Yeah.
we're gonna come up with something.
Amazing. Yeah, so basically we would your talk was about space and in a sort of like quite in some ways material sense. And I mean material because I guess what I was thinking about was I've done like a lecture series a few times over the years about contradiction and subjectivity as an emancipatory contradiction. And I guess it has some connotations in terms of like if you think about it, um, in terms of certain dimensionality that is a space, claiming a point of contradiction or a moment of contradiction or, the nowness of the contradiction, the ever presence of a contradiction that is often um, we feel a demand in a subjective sense to eradicate. Um, and this comes with certain consequences for Hegel in terms of how we organize society and how we approach the world around us. And so when you were talking about space as this, um, like really thinking about it as a thing, I guess, like turning it into an actual concrete, I think this is like a really important step.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the material sense, I think that kind of the connection that could be made, and maybe we'll come on to it, and it'll be really interesting to hear what you think, in terms of this question of like the political. Is there something about making space, what space, like how space comes about, what space is that can be connected to the spaces we need to make politically in terms of thought, in terms of um, coming up with novel approaches, in terms of holding space for the structure of our subjectivity, this kind of thing. I think there could be like an interesting connection there. So maybe do you want to like talk a little bit about your theory of like your conception of space?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Helen. I mean, there's so many interesting points you just brought up. Beginning, just with what you said about contradiction, which is so much what we're all thinking. We're thinking about negativity, we're thinking about contradiction as it constitutes not just ontology, but like you talked about politics, about subjectivity. And so space is such an interesting way to think through these problems because space presents, first of all, just a very imminent contradiction, right? That we're thinking about, if we think of space just in itself, but we're thinking about nothingness as such, right? Replacing nothingness. We're saying the nothing is.
Yeah.
This is an ancient contradiction, right? Going back to the ancient atomists, when when we have, the writings from Lucretius, or even thinking about Democritus and the fragments we have there, when we place being, matter, as an
Mhm.
atom, as a one, right? We have to also name the void. We have to name emptiness. So just at the very basic level, when it comes to ontology, we're presented with not just something, but with nothing as well, right? This great, Heideggerian question, why is there something and not nothing? So this is obviously like a really grounding question of something and nothing, which space has a huge role in. But like you bring up, this is not just a materialistic question, right? When it comes to subjectivity, we, following like a Lacanian Hegelian tradition, know that subjectivity is itself constituted around a void, around an emptiness, around some contradictory cut. So there's this question of space and the void as well when it comes to subjectivity. Um, and so that will follow through with politics as well. I mean, there's so many kind of pieces here. I think the way to ground all of this in space at the most basic level is to think about emptiness and empty space as just indifference, right? Is just completely penetrable, not having any difference in itself. Well, this is a fun paradox for us as thinkers of difference because we'd say, well, where do I go from there, right? I'm kind of
Mhm.
stuck. I'm at a standstill. I'm just thinking of indifferent space. What happens next? And what we're really asking is how do we create a cut of difference into indifference from both an ontological level, but also politically, right? If we have just, let's say, two groups of people or a political situation that's completely indifferent and there's not really a way to orient ourselves around this problem, there isn't some cut of difference. We need to ask, well, how do we bring that cut of difference into the equation? When it comes to ontology, and we think about the indifference of space, does it call forth difference? Well, one interesting thing that Hegel says about space in the philosophy of nature is that space is beside itself. It's side by side. It's side by
Mhm.
sideness. And so already we have what seems like this imminent movement of negativity within space, that even space is homogeneous and yet isn't self-same. It's
Mhm.
not identical with itself. It doesn't overlap with itself. It is beside itself.
Mhm.
There's always something being placed next to itself. So there's this negativity that comes forth within just emptiness itself. So we can talk about that in terms of subjectivity, right?
Yeah.
When we think about the subject is that which is beside herself,
Mhm.
right? I can talk about
Yeah.
myself as Catherine in this way, right? So we even see that kind of like imminent coming forth of difference from the subject. But for politics, I mean, that's like another interesting question. But maybe I'll pause there. I kind of
Yeah.
feel like I'm putting out a bunch of different
It's
different
so
thoughts.
interesting. I do really like this idea of this like likening or drawing a parallel between subjectivity and this question of space, because the subject, what is self-consciousness is um, the contradiction of the universe witnessing itself and speaking of itself. But in order to do that, there is this standing beside itself. And it's interesting because I was thinking about something that comes up a lot, like funnily at the moment. So the documentary filmmaker Adam Curtis, he's got a new project coming out. And every time Adam Curtis releases a new film, I get loads of people sending me like, "Oh, you're gonna love this. He's got a new," and I'm like, "Hang on, guys, I fucking hate Adam Curtis." The point being here is that I find myself, and I think this is just like the most contrarian, hyper contrarian, like just I don't know, taste question. But I really do feel, and I like this is like maybe I'm just like justifying my own like stupidity with Hegel, but like this negation of the negation. So I always reserve my greatest critique for the critique, or that which claims to be a critique, right? So maybe I should write something on Adam Curtis at some point, or Adam Curtis, not on him, but on his movies. But obviously he places himself as a character in these things. But so this question of space. And as soon as you name space, right, as soon as you name anything, you're negating something about the space.
Mhm.
It's a limitation that cannot embrace the totality of the space. And this is where the contradiction comes in. So, in terms of politics, and we do live in a very, I mean, this is kind of a leap, and maybe we can kind of do the logical steps to get there in a second. But in terms of one of the issues of our contemporary moment, and this is, there in Hegel in terms of how he conceives of the progress slash, in some ways, regress of history, that we have different orders of society that become better and better at handling slash repressing contradiction. So things become more and more positivistic. We attended a talk the other day by a colleague of Alfie's called Ben Moore. He works in Amsterdam on money, the idea of money in 19th century literature. And what's interesting about the 19th century literature is that money at this point is much more like a clear representation of a contradiction and like something that can be talked about much more than it becomes in the 21st century because of the way that capitalism represses even where value and value extraction come from. So that like the contradiction of capitalism becomes more and more repressed, and we feel greater and greater freedom, but we have less and less of it, and we're more and more exploited in sort of more uh, like obscure ways. So the idea is that politically, it's not enough to just negate or to just offer a critique, because the movement of the contradiction of history in its sort of bad faith, bad infinite in terms of like the way that capitalism organizes itself around contradiction, finds a way to capitalize upon this negativity that's not a negativity, but like an attempt to positive. So what can happen is it's precisely through the confidence of critique, of primary negation, that you get a form of progress in history that is in fact regressive, because there is no space for a negation of the negation. And politically, we see this kind of today in, this is something that like people have talked about in terms of like the fragmentation of politics through social media, the oppositional nature of capitalist subjectivity, how it's impossible to think outside of the friend enemy distinction. And we have no space, or we have no concept of negation being a limited move without the negation of the negation. So you have like and this is where like so as soon as you name and conceive of something, there is a necessity, a political necessity or a truth necessity to point to where this negation is a limit in and of itself. Do you see what I mean? Maybe that doesn't make sense, but yeah.
No, yeah. No, completely. I mean, yeah, I love the kind of terms we're talking in right now in terms of thinking about space within what is like a naturalizing and indifferent force of capitalism, and the question of how do we really create something truly different, a negation of negation, in order to exit our current situation, right?
Mhm.
And this could be like just like on a personal level, like a bad situation I'm in, maybe like with a bad partner or something, or it could be just really broadly politically, right? How do we escape the indifference that we're in, right? And so when we bring space into this, I think this is a fun way to think about it because, like we mentioned earlier, space is just indifference, right?
Mhm.
It's all just the same at a certain level until we start organizing it with points, right? We start creating places and we start differentiating it. And so this is all going to tie together. But one one thing that Kojev says that I think is really powerful in his lectures on Hegel, he says that without man, nature would be space and only space. No, I think that's really interesting to think about it, and it's going to all tie into politics because nature itself for Hegel is just like indifferent stuff, right? It's just indifferent materiality. It doesn't have a concept of itself. And once you and I start naming things, start organizing nature, start measuring things, we're introducing the cut of difference into nature itself. We weave the void into materiality. This is what spirited beings do.
Yeah.
Like in a Derridian or in a Zizekian way, when we start to constitute beings and name them, well, we're constituting that being around some sort of emptiness, right? Right? Around something that it's not, around some contradiction. We weave the void into materiality. So what I want to say here is that when we don't do that, right, when we're just indifferent, when we just are naturalized in our surroundings, and I'm naturalized in like brushing my teeth every morning, naturalized in going to work every day, when we naturalize our behavior, we become indifferent to what we're doing, to our surroundings, to the economy broadly. And capitalism does this, right? Capitalism really naturalizes our current predicament, which is a very obvious, like historically contingent place that we find ourselves in. But part of the ideology behind capitalism is that this is natural what humans do, right? We naturally are greedy. We naturally organize in this sort of hierarchical, privatizing way. Um, and as we naturalize our dependence upon capitalism, we say, well, there's no way out. This is the only way it could be. We're just perpetuating indifference. So again, the question comes up, well, how do we cut that indifference with a genuine difference, right? With something that is really a new term in the situation. Like here, I think about Badiou, right? Because what Badiou asks us to do is to introduce an impossible new term into the quotidian everyday situation that never existed before. And now we can have a true event, whether it's the love event, right? When two people meet, oh my gosh, here's a totally impossible thing. I'm falling in love with someone.
Mhm.
That's totally new and it
Yeah.
opens up a new world.
Yeah.
And politically, one of his best examples of the political event, the classic example, but a great one, the French Revolution.
Mhm.
When we think about the overthrow of the monarchy, that was a completely impossible situation, a completely impossible event.
Mhm.
But we introduced a radically new term into the indifference of the situation, a true difference, a true cut. And in a spatial sense, what we're really doing is we're localizing the void for Badiou.
Yeah.
We're placing the impossible void and we're placing it somewhere and we're saying, boom, that's where it is in a very physical sense, like at a site, at the Bastille for him, right?
Yeah.
That's where we place this event and this impossibility and open up a new world.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's like so well put because it is, in a sense, a question of like animation or reanimation or sort of this is where I mean it's interesting like the question of like theology and religion and where that has gone and what confessional religions have on the one hand as a sort of positive aspect, I don't know, as one aspect, and then another which is like we can say that in terms of like the bad infinite of like let's say cultic or magical thinking or whatever. This is a very, capitalism is very good at this. There is a sort of like idolatry of money as God or as a system as sort of like God given in a certain way. But we're missing a sort of theology critique, as in for instance, as soon as you recognize God as outside of yourself, rather than as Lacan points out through the 20th 21st century, like God becomes unconscious, which is like there's no even recognition or naming of some aspect of subjectivity that is like God-shaped whole or desire for fulfillment, this kind of thing. And by like naming or spiritualizing, there is some at least recognition of this existence. But it's also interesting how capitalism as well. It does the opposite. This is a very, well-known comment in Marx that like everything is that is sacred is profaned. So it does a very good job at despiritualizing whilst also having this sort of drive aspect that seems magical. So we have like the commodity. I'm just looking at a pair of shoes over there. The commodity book has this sort of magic power over us, but it's not recognized as such, and it leads to all sorts of sacrifice in all sorts of different ways that are like not recognized. But at the same time, everything becomes evened out. I was in a bookshop a few years ago, and I remember it was like just this crazy, it wasn't even books put on display, but it was like a self-help section of the book. I think it was in like 2019. And there were, I kid you not, like 20 different books which revolved around a swear word in their title. So it was like, look how radical and provocative this is. I'm selling you, provocation, radicalism, which again, like you have certain apexes of the progress of history in the 20th century that become commoditized, things like civil rights and social justice that then become commoditized, and we want to be this sort of radical figure. And in our radicalism, we actually become the opposite, as in a radicalism that just becomes a sort of empty shell of, true sort of change or imagining change or moving towards change. But basically every book in the shop, in this sort of section of the shop, it was like the subtle art of not giving a fuck, like who gives a shit. And it was literally like so many titles with their sort of bright things saying like fuck, shit, blah, blah, bastards, to don't let the girls. And you think like this is just like such an example of where capitalism sells you the radical for something that is actually just completely like the tallest daisy is shorn down. It's all the same. It's literally the same product. So this question of like animation versus desacralizing in capitalism is really interesting. And this question, as you point to in terms of Badiou, of, and it is interesting because I was also having a conversation the other day about like when did this version of the culture war that we witnessed in the 21st century on the internet start? And people have talked about Gamergate and sort of Coney 2012 and things like this. But I was thinking about the new atheist movement, which is also comes before that even, which is this very sort of oppositional, almost like a totalizing attempt to, or an attempted totalizing way of kind of explicating, as in like a religious turn in the claim that there is no such thing as anything other than a version of material reality, which, of course, if you take it far enough back, there is no material reality without lack in the first place. But I was like, I always do this, I was go on a little tangent. So we're talking about culture war, we're talking about reanimating, we're talking about, oh, damn. I feel like I was going somewhere and I sidetracked myself with my own silly inner monologue.
No worries. I
It'll come
can
back to me. It'll
jump
come back.
in.
Yeah. Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question about spirituality and capitalism.
Yeah.
Like if we were just kind of contrasting the naturalizing capitalism to say like, yeah, everything is indifferent. This is the way things are. If we contrast that with spirit for Hegel, right,
Mm.
which I mean, we can look at this in so many ways. A more analytic tradition would just say Geist is mind, right? A
Yeah.
more continental tradition might translate Geist as spirit. But if we look at what is spirit for Hegel, it really is differentiation, right? It really is negativity in
Mhm.
a very
Mhm.
strong sense, right?
Yeah.
That, I like as a spirited being am a differentiation with myself, right? I'm a cut into myself. I think one of my favorite quotes right now on this that I've been thinking about for the last few weeks, not from Hegel, but from Lacan from Seminar 10, he quotes Baudelaire and he says, I am the cut and the knife. Je suis la plaie et le couteau. I am both, or like I am the wound and the knife is like a better translation. But I
Mhm.
think this is such a nice way to think about, I mean, for Lacan, what the subject is doing, but let's read it. Let's read it with Hegel. We can do that. What spirit is doing and what subjectivity is doing as well, right, is introducing a cut of negativity And it is that which cuts as well, right? It is the thing that's doing that. And so, in a really strong contrast to like a naturalizing capitalism, if we are really thinking, if we are really being spirited beings, we're introducing difference into where there is indifference. And that's where we get like a really interesting debate with Lacan and Badiou here, right? And I'm really partial to Badiou's reading of the subject as rare in this way, which I think when I first encountered this critique, I was like, but aren't we all subjects, right? Like, how can subjectivity be rare? But it's a really nice reading because it really forces one to say, no, you're only really a subject. You're only really interpolated into an event if you do introduce this cut of negativity, if you do step outside the indifferent situation that you're in, and you, I mean, for Badiou, if you have fidelity to a truth event, right, to a political event, a love event, science or art event. And I like that framework because it forces us to say, am I just kind of going about my day-to-day life, like if we're thinking politically and economically, like within this capitalist structure? Do I go to work every day? And this is like Frank Gruda's point, right, in his book Indifference to Repetition, which I think is a really good point that if I do the same thing every day, I go to work every day, and I don't really think about what I'm doing, well, I'm not really free, right? I
Mhm.
could say, like, oh, I could always leave, again, like a bad relationship or a bad job. Oh, I'm always free to leave. But if you don't leave, are you really free? And this is where Badiou's critique comes in, which I think is a really nice one, right? That no, you're only free or you're only a subject when you really break outside the constraints that you're in and you introduce a new term into the situation. And this is a new space, right? When you say, I'm displeased with the current place I'm occupying. What's outside of this delimited place? Oh, more space, more
Mhm.
potentiality.
Mhm.
And if I can step outside of that and say, wow, there is all this potentiality out here. I mean, it's angsty, right? You become very anxious just looking at the void, looking at empty space and place. But once you can place that emptiness, place that impossibility, you open up a new world for yourself. So that's, I think, like just to bring it back to spirituality, right? Like what's really at stake when it comes to all these new ways of trying to domesticate what is really like a radical act of spirit, right? Within just like this indifferent kind of like capitalist world that we live in.
Absolutely, because I mean, it does make me think of, the term, Mark Fisher's term, capitalist realism, and what it is about capitalism that's so good at leading us to, as you say, take things for granted. Because in a sense, and this is where analysis against the university discourse, which once an analysis has been made and has been published and has been carried forward as a commodity of promise, can become this reconcretizing factor in terms of a justification mechanism for capital. And I think this is really, and I think this has happened. It happens as a residue of the way in which we as subjects are inevitably drawn to denying or repressing angst, or angst as a result of lack. But I also think in terms of like the university industrial complex as it has been neoliberalized and tied to capitalism, has sort of come about. But also I also think, and obviously Badiou has written about this a lot, like love, the love event, and how love is different from romance, or love is, this question of can love be possible when the commons themselves or human interaction itself is commoditized. So I guess this is a question, because of course, in terms of like so I want to go back to like the university discourse in a second, but like in terms of when we have like material analyses of politics, there is this question of and it's funny, I used to do this podcast, and a friend of mine has this like quiz he invented for his students. He's a political theorist, where he used to like work out sort of like a sort of BuzzFeedy like personality quiz, like how much of a materialist are you versus idealist? And I was like 99% materialist. But I also think that like the material explication does is precisely what permits. I mean, it just is logically true and manifestly true, the fact that we're both the wound and the knife. So we do have agency as subjects. And it is true, like a materialist critique would be like, the material conditions are what formulate desire. And I absolutely think this is true in terms of even psychoanalysis says this, like what we experience. And again, this is the question of like immanent transcendence, like what we experience as choice, what we experience as subjectivity is also a material question. And this is the dialectical materialist point, like we can't ever get outside of that. But there is always this space as a human subject, there's potential for space. So whilst capitalism does such a good job at, making manifest capitalist realism and there's no outside of it, there is always this possibility. But in terms of the encroachment of capital, which, as you say, is so mystified through this question of, oh, it's humans are selfish, this is inevitable, this is the progress of history, blah, blah, blah. I was literally just watching a YouTube video about like, I think it's about mortgages or something. But this guy was ranting about how people who are anti-capitalist, da 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 da, we wouldn't have the, I don't know, the light bulb. And you're like, oh, is that scientific progress? Like I'm very much think that we would have a lot more of that if we didn't have capitalism. But anyway, a lot more scientific discovery. But anyway, so because I do think that capitalist logic actually runs antithetical to what is required intellectually for scientific discovery and novelty to take place. But just in terms of the university discourse and the way in which capitalism confidently offers us what seems like progress to the greater destruction of our freedom or the potential for space or contradiction to manifest something new. And of course, as we, when people talk about like late stage capitalism, it's like we have no idea until everything is commoditized, And of course, we are in terms of platform capitalism, in terms of social media, in a period where the social relation is commoditized. So there, in this, and maybe we can talk about this next, in terms of how commodity logic squeezes out space and how capitalism attempts to offer a one-to-one promise in terms of, well, in fact, like the whole commodity logic is about closure. You feel this contingent lack. Here's a commodity which can get rid of that lack. But that contingent lack is actually ontological and what generates everything, basically. So in a way, even the commodity promises it and can't offer it, and that's why capitalism keeps going in a certain sense, but also the fact that it can't, maybe that's also like an emancipatory potential right there, like that it just can't make good in its promise. But I also kind of just wanted to say about like the university discourse, how this is where the negation of like we can't take anything for granted ever, like ever. So obviously, when a scientific discovery has been made or whatever, we double blind it, we test it, and it's like it's manifestly true that this happens, whatever. But we can always build on, and science sort of discovers these new dimensions that are that are ways of us mapping our reality that is like infinitely complex. But in terms of politics, we have such like a false certainty often of. I always think about like abstraction. There were all these accusations a few years ago about adjacency, like you're right adjacent or fascist adjacent or communist adjacent, which is this really non-political logic in terms of it. Like I think some people have framed it in terms of conversion, right? Like this encountering of the possibility of the fact that you have been wrong, or the fact that there is something new to be understood in an encounter. And adjacency is very much this sort of attempt to replicate the A equals A logic in another context, which is like illogical in the first place because A never is A. So that we have this sort of logic that comes up of, if you're not with me, you're against me, or there's a special place in hell for my enemies. If you don't say this, then you are this. And it's sort of abstractive logic, which I think is the opposite of political logic. And abstractive logic is a logic as well that is trying to close the space of infinite possibility of conversion by first of all attempting to replicate A in a context and then constantly replicate it for reasons of um, angst and potentially in terms of like how badly the economy is treating us as individuals, precarity reasons, desperation reasons, it's very difficult to get a footing when the world really is as bad as it is. Anyway, sorry. But yeah,
No,
maybe,
no.
yeah. Could you talk about this question of the commodity and space and how is there something in the fact that the commodity logic or the promise of the commodity is to close space?
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail completely on the head there from my perspective, right? That, like you said, the commodity is meant to sort of stuff up a gap that
Mhm.
we all have, right? A constitutive subjective lack and tell us that we don't actually lack. We can obtain our object of desire. But really, this is the drive, right? That we're going to keep buying, keep buying, keep trying to stuff up that gap. And I think that actually really, it's really like a nice way to the conversation on materialism and idealism as well, right? Because clearly it's a material commodity, but it's doing something beyond the material,
Yeah.
right? It's trying to satisfy the drive, satisfy this gap of desire within the subject. Um, but altogether, like you said, this attempt to close up this gap is really like an attempt towards immediacy, right? That I'll just immediately be able to feel what, my desire, and there won't be this gap. And gaps are always mediating, right? I think this is the nice thing about whenever we see gaps in general is there's probably something interesting happening here, that there's some mediation, there's some void being introduced. Whereas when things are just immediate, this is naturalizing again, right? This is where we don't have thought
Yeah.
anymore. This is where
Yeah.
spirit starts to exit, really, if spirit is that which is introducing the gap. And so I think in like a really basic way, we can think about what, this question, the question of materialism and idealism. I mean, like as a good Hegelian, I want to have my cake and eat it too, when it comes to materialism and idealism. And I think when we look at materiality, right? When we look, this is going to relate to the commodity, right? But when we think about um, this fundamental paradox of the atom and the void, right? I think this is where we get this nice little Hegelian twist. At this very basic level, we want to say, here's materiality, here's the atom,
Mhm.
and then ideality, nothingness, the void, something that the idea creates. But what if it were precisely the opposite, right? Like in a Zizekian twist. What if what we're really talking about is the materiality of nothingness, right? That it's nothing that exists, and that the atom, when we name it as one, when we count it as one, we say, here's something material that I can now unify. I mean, this is an idea, right? This is an idealization that I can disentangle an entangled material world, and I can place some irreducible piece of matter on a pedestal and say, there it is, that's one, that's the atom, that's indivisible. Mladen Delar has put it like really succinctly, and he's had a few texts on this in commenting on Hegel's notions of materialism and idealism. Mladen Delar just says the atom is an idea, that there is irreducibility, there is oneness. So if we take it back to the commodity, right, we have an idea that this materiality will stuff up what is really material is that there is a gap, that there
Yeah.
is nothingness as such. So I mean, I think this is just like a fun little Hegelian inversion, a fun way to think about these two different things about nothingness and substance, right? But moreover, there is this, like, I mentioned before as well, this question of immediacy as well, right? Of not having a mediating gap between oneself and the reality that one exists in, right? Just desiring a complete, like a feeling of everything at once, right? Everything everywhere all at once is kind of the fantasy of this, right? That
Yeah.
there is nothing mediating and I can feel it all in this exact moment. So I think there is something spatial happening there as well. But yeah, I hope that idealism, materialism analysis made sense in terms of the
Yeah,
ideas of
absolutely. Yeah,
materiality
yeah.
that stuffs up my own lack.
Do you know what I was also kind of thinking in terms of material or matter and something more? So, obviously in terms of capitalism, we talk about surplus value. We talk about, in terms of psychoanalysis, it's like there's no surprise. Let's just say that maybe somebody called Marx was writing at a certain point in the 19th century where contradictions were emerging that were becoming clearer and commentable upon, just as Freud discovers the unconscious at a certain point in this mode of production as a symptom, a set of symptoms starts to emerge as a result of the repressions of the contradiction, because this excess has to go somewhere, right? So, and this is again like the question of like the political potentiality of psychoanalysis or whatever, or that maybe that this is like something hopeful, that all is not lost always, because there is a residue when lack is repressed. There is a return of the repressed. And this is also so like in terms of, I was just thinking about like never taking anything as a given. Like it's no surprise that in psychoanalysis, the analyst discourse, you can go on, and I certainly do this, on and on and on about the same thing, and also experience both like conversion in relation to a single signifier, or the experience of conversion, the experience of novelty. Like I'm always go, actually with my ex, I had about 7 topics I'd always go on about, and it's like, oh, we're talking about topic 1 through 7, which one is it? And it's like, but I'll always be like, oh my God, I just had such a realization that this means this for me. And it's actually like, oh, you've said this like 1,000 times already, but like there's this experience that there's something kind of novel. But it is true that like, you have a set of let's say, because of the contingent nature of your fundamental fantasy, like things that you revolve around, and there is like a never-ending depth to a reframing, a thinking about, a talking about a singular thing. But that what we do have in capitalism is a set of, we have subjective suffering in relation to our denial of lack. And this points to something, but what is sort of worrying today is how those sets of symptoms, and obviously that there's like there are biological, all sorts of biological, as embodied beings, there are all sorts of biological like mental health issues or biological things that affect subjectivity, etc., etc. But there are also these subjective manifestations as a result of what we're going through, what we will go through, and how the way in which this is rationalized or commodified or repressed as some kind of like positivistic thing that can be medicated or problematized or solved. Well, not problematized, solved, or set as a contingent problem that can be solved. So I guess the point being is that the residue. So when we like maybe like like a balloon that you try to squash, there's always like it's going somewhere, and this excess that penetrates places is commentable upon and is recognizable and is potentially, in terms of when Lacan is writing about psychosis, the Santom symptom, Santom, saintly man, the messenger that tells us something that is worth looking at. So I guess, yeah, the point being is it's not, we don't get away with negation.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah,
I mean, I think this is again like an interesting question of like the materiality of negation,
yeah,
because in analysis, if there isn't an end of analysis, we hope that we can reorient ourselves around our symptom in a more productive way, or in a way that's less damaging to our everyday life. And ideally, we are renegotiating the signifier that got stuck in the flesh, right? We're hopefully renegotiating a new S1, a new quilting point in our subjective reality, which again means that we're placing the void in a very particular way, right? We're admitting the materiality of the void that is structuring our reality and our subjectivity, which is traumatic and horrifying, right? That what's at the basis of materialism is nothingness in a really strong sense. And we reorient ourselves in this way by quilting a new S1 into our chain of signification, into how we cope with that nothingness, right? And so And this is, I mean, Badu does a really similar move here when it comes to the event, right? And I mean, he might, like arrest me for saying this, but when we name an event, we're placing the void and we're naming a
Hmm.
new event. We're introducing a new term into the situation, which very much functions like an S1 in
Yeah.
this way as well, right? So not just on like a personal level with an analysis, but also like politically, we have to like introduce this new term, a new organization of our ideas, right? Of how we cope with the material world and with lack by specifically placing that impossibility, that void as such. So, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because we constantly are seeing the void woven into everything that we're doing, right? Just with language, we know that when we speak, the void is sutured to every word that we speak, right? That, for Badu, when we start to count, when ontology begins at all, when we have a count as one, that count is always sutured to the void, and the void's always lurking in this way. So when it comes to rethinking capitalism and exiting the situation that we're in, we need to, likewise think about where are we going to place impossibility and what is it that's really impossible, right? Like that there is no end to capitalism, but more radically, right? Like what is the truth that we can reorganize around, right? I mean, probably I would think it'd be something to do with like a worker's emancipation, right? That's really the truth of the exploitative system here, and that we have like a possibility for reorganization in this way. But even that has to be again organized and said, this is impossible, but let's create a new term for it and
Mhm.
introduce something impossible into the situation and name it as such.
No, absolutely, because there is in terms of like the discomfort of novelty related to the political, the lines get drawn in such a way that there is such a fear of so okay, I think about the ways in which people of different political stripes try to negotiate reality. So you might look at something like Trump with his tariffs, which obviously, as has been manifest recently, total nonsense. But he's also recognized something of the failures of capitalism as they stand at the moment and has, with his misguided logic and reactionary logic, uh, misinterpreted the signs, diagnosed wrong, and offered a solution that is more capitalism and more exploitative and kind of worse. And also, one of the issues of history is and this is the sort of nostalgic reactionary sort of stuff in terms of, although it's funny when you think about like what when Trump talks about like make America great again, which period of history is he talking about? Is he talking about like
Mm.
post-war, which was like a more social democratic society that had that in a sense, because of the threat of communism, America and the West had to sort of, was forced into certain relationality with its workers and things like this. But there comes a sort of, so again, this abstractive, if you say this, then you're this. If you say that, if you do this, then you're this. But there is also always in these attempts, when they are reactionary, an attempt to respond to something that's not working. And I just sort of think about, um, I think the predicament that we're in at the moment related to globalization, which I think looks similar, but is very different to, let's say, internationalism, which is something that was maybe pointed to by certain anti-capitalist thinkers at different times. And it can look or sound similar, but they're actually very kind of antithetical ways of organizing society. So what often happens is you have a diagnosis of reality, an attempt to distance yourself from that reality, and a replication of that reality in the confidence of the embodiment of a new signifier that is, in fact, structurally dealing with lack in the same way. So, for instance, one of the issues today is in a globalized economy, how do we deal with capital mobility and tax. We can't unless there is some global or international agreement on tax that is set as a sort of universal level. So in a sense, we have, and this would be like the internationalist versus the globalist thing. So in a globalist world, you have like multipolar, where we have capitalism everywhere, but everybody is set against one another, and you have this competitive system where you sort of like race to the bottom in terms of who can offer the billionaires more incentives to trickle down to create jobs in the short term. But this is a response to the fact that like basically the rate of profit in capitalism goes to zero, and then you have like a lurch towards monopolies, towards capitalists not paying tax in order to keep their bottom line sustained, and all this kind of stuff. And then you have, in terms of the 20th century, post-colonialism, or a version of colonialism that was like empire conscious, really kind of out there and recognized. You have a kind of righteous and justice oriented small nation movement kind of thing. But because we have capitalism, we inevitably have more and more colonialism that is more and more mystified, that's more and more privatized, that occurs in different ways. But these small nations become, let's say, victim to a capitalist imperative, which basically means they have to offer themselves up as tax havens. So because there's sort of no alternative. So in this global world, which is global, but like I think about Todd's critique of Adorno, where Adorno basically is like, the issue with Nazism is that it's totalitarian. But the fact is, in terms of you look at like reactionary movements or fascist movements, they cannot embrace lack. They render lack contingent. They cast an enemy who sustains behind, in their shadow, behind their sort of imagined form, a perfect world in which lack would be obliterated. So it's like precisely an inability to be total that leads to fascistic thinking, in terms of if total incorporates literally everything, including lack. So when we talk about like in some ways, the globalist world is not total enough. It is not international enough. It is not global enough, because we cannot have a world in which we find a way to capture surplus value that is really rightfully that of the workers. And in fact, it sort of becomes this exponential thing where it's not only like it's not taxed, but as soon as you have corporations like Apple paying a 0.05% rate of tax in Ireland, they then become in the ascendancy relative to the state, who becomes the lapdog of capital. Not that there weren't problems with the state and capital before, but it's tied in sort of this way that, so in a sense, like you look at people but take sort of received ideas from Marx that were applicable at a certain time and are still applicable if they're applied in a certain way. So it's like we have to have more fidelity to this material analysis at a time when things become so mystified and appear different, but aren't. So this question of like empire, is it different when it's an individual corporation doing it versus a state? And was not colonialism also meted out by individual corporations that were funded by states, which they sort of are now in terms of subsidies, tax evasion, blah, blah, blah. So we actually have like a very similar situation cast in a different mode. But so I guess that what I'm trying to say is like, you have these critiques of something which can go in a certain direction, but in fact, the critique leading off into like an alternate oppositional reality to the thing can double down the thing, and maybe we need more of the thing. So I'm just thinking in terms of like global tax agreements, for instance, like in a world where we are individualized as a global, we have this race to the bottom where smaller nations are more exploited, and this exploitation leads to greater exploitation of workers universally, but without some kind of international agreement in terms of how we limit Anyway, yeah, I don't know. That's maybe not like that clear, but it's just a question of like signifiers that we, when we think oppositionally, when we think in a binary sense, when we think in a like a sort of self-certain sense without a reflection constantly on an interruption in those signifiers, we can really be led down the garden path in a really confident way that actually imprisons us because of our confidence. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, the tariff thing is so interesting because it used to be a liberal issue, right?
Yeah.
Like this used to be on the left, people wanted tariffs. I think like the Obama-Romney debate, I think Obama was in favor of tariffs during this one. And we've had a complete switch, right, in political discourse that now Trump is in favor of tariffs, which, like you said, admits that there's failures of capitalism and failures of the free market. But I think that what like the irony demonstrates to us, right, that both the left and the right are saying, at different times that we need maybe some erective barrier to stop, some sort of race to the bottom from happening. I mean, I think it just demonstrates that whether we're talking about like a smooth or a striated space, to put it like in Deleuze and Guattari's words, the smooth or striated political space, that like what capital does is it circumvents barriers, right?
Mhm.
So whether or not we have just a smooth space for capital to just like wreak its havoc, or we have barriers erected, right? Capital will find a way around this. But I do think that you're right, though, that between, like globalization has often just been code for deregulation, right? That we should let money flow between all countries and not have any regulation. And if it really is cheaper somewhere to produce goods, let it be so, right? Whereas I think an internationalism would say, no, how do we regulate things for the workers? How do we institute like a basic living standard for everybody around the world while living within the confines of capitalism? How do we try and mitigate this as best as we can, right? I mean, that gets to the heart of a difficult debate, right? Which is how do we deal with capitalism in the moment and try and erect safety measures for the really the worst off,
Mhm.
while at the same time talking about revolution, right? Like, how do we avoid just putting a band-aid on cancer, right? And saying, no, we really have to do away with it all. Um, but yeah, this, vision of, yeah, whether the world is just open and smooth or strided with different obstacles, right? Capital does find a way to exploit us in different ways. And I think, particularly, um, one of the sort of like great examples today of like this core periphery, another great kind of spatial way of thinking of the world and capital is that, today we're told that, artificial intelligence eliminates the needs for labor, but we've just sent this labor to the global south, right? I mean, different companies will even lie and say, oh, AI is going to fix your audio on your track, or, fix the video that you've sent us. But really, it's somebody in the global south who is doing all those fixes, but we've just masked it as the machine, which is, it's a very Marxist. I mean, he was, presaging this in a way, right? That the more the machine can replace the labor and push the labor to its most basic rudimentary costs without, education, without any higher level of skill, right? The sort of like mystification of skill. Um, that's what the factory will do. That's what capital will do. And now we're even just pretending the labor doesn't exist at all, right? We're like, it is just machine and that's it. Um, so yeah, I think, yeah, the tariff thing is just like this, yeah, very ironic kind of back and forth ping pong game in a lot of ways. But yeah, I guess that's the way I would look at that. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I totally. It's interesting in terms of like the temporality and like as you say, things change in terms of this person said this X number of years ago. Like I don't know, um, the left used to be associated with sort of anti-vax and organic and clean,
Mhm.
so I guess there's
Completely.
always this kind of like contingency of the moment in terms of how history unfolds and then who positions themselves relative to what, and obviously tariffs being a throwback, that but again like it is interesting as well just in terms of like differentiating between like a tariff logic and an internationalist logic. They can like look similar, but it's actually completely different. And it's funny, I don't know if you've ever had an experience where you talk to somebody who's like very skeptical about like society or whatever, and then they talk. There's a funny Peep Show episode about this where he has a Mark has a colleague who he gets along really well with, and then at a certain point he's like, oh my God, not like that. Like he has like really crazy political ideas and sort of goes off the deep end or whatever. You're like, well, okay, no, the solution's not that. Um, but yeah, no, it is. And it's also really interesting, as you say, like about how, and this is obviously to do as well with the impoverishment of graduates and things like this with AI, quote unquote. And the machine, well, and the difference between uh, Marxist period potentially and the possibility to um, articulate things in a certain way. And again, this talk that a friend gave the other day about money in the 19th century novel, when it becomes so mystified, it becomes so confusing, But
Mhm.
it's so funny. There's a funny story about, this like Apple Fresh, no, not Apple Fresh, Amazon Fresh, or whatever these stores where you go
Mhm.
in, like it could work out what you'd taken. And actually, it's just some poor person watching it on a CCTV camera and like adding it together on a calculator, absolutely crazy. Um, but yeah, the mystification of value and like also, the promise of a future where the payment will eventually come. I think about this all the time in terms of graduates. So instead of actually like, so at first you go to college, you work, you produce value. This value is appropriated by your employer. You get paid for the job. Then you have to start paying to go to college. Then you have to go into debt to go to college. Then you have to go into debt and get a master's degree and then get a job, debt, master's degree, and an internship, and then you get a job. So obviously, the delayment of payment, and this is also to do with how labor is not recognized. So when labor is not recognized or is even seen as a privilege, precisely because people are so impoverished, the payment comes in prestige or in the promise of payment, um, which is like a really crazy state of affairs. I guess the next thing I was going to ask you was about this. This often happens when I'm like teaching students, and you're talking about like Hegel, let's say, as opposed to some other political philosophers. Students will sometimes say, but what's the praxis? Right?
Mhm.
Like, what are we supposed to do? And I have a quite a funny story, which I sometimes tell about what I think the praxis is, quote unquote. But again, as soon as you denominate a praxis, does it become the opposite of the thing? Can you actually predetermine what an explosion of, let's say, can we ever, the owl of Minerva flies at us, can we ever predict how we should go about it? And as soon as we follow a certain form of expectations or preset, um, concluded, determined actions relative to the thing that we're trying to, is that not the problem in and of itself?
Yeah, this is a great question and something that, I mean, like as a thinker, I think about all the time and I struggle with, right? Which is praxis. So, are we just in an ivory tower reading Hegel and does it have any real political implication? And I think we should take it really seriously, that question. Um, when I first started reading Badiou and thinking about the introduction of the impossible into the situation, I remember asking my advisor, Frank Ruda, like, well, how do we do it? How do we actualize an event? And he would say, well, Badiou tells us exactly how to do this. There's an impossibility that
Yeah.
we name. And I remember feeling so, like unsatisfied with this and being like, but this doesn't answer my question. And even this is Zizek's critique of Badiou, right? That he makes in several different places that I don't think he goes so far as to call it a mysticism, but he definitely says that there's something lacking in this explanation that if we're just saying we need to have the impossible happen, I mean, this isn't really explanatory, right? And that is one of the cruxes of their disagreement, right? Um, so I guess we have to dig a little bit deeper then and say like, what does it mean to like precipitate the impossible, right? And I guess that, oh, if I were to try and like intervene in what is a really great debate, I mean, in a really simple way, we have to open up a space of indeterminacy, right? We have to say what is the space of the indeterminate where we don't know left or right, where we don't have orientation, where there isn't up or down. And once we enter that space in a very, Heideggerian sense, when we confront nothingness as such, right? This is anxiety, right? Anxiety is not without object for Lacan, right? In other words, it has something to do with the void, right? If it's not without object. And so we have to, I think, do exactly that. We have to ask ourselves, where is there a lack of determinacy? And I think, again, if we bring it, this is what I love about Badu, is I can always kind of like bring it back to the love event, which most people, like, this is the great truth that most people experience in their life, even if they never experience the truth of a political, scientific, or art event. Many of us have fallen in love, right? And when you have this cataclysmic event happen to you, you're like, oh my gosh, am I about to say yes to something that's going to completely upend my entire life? I'm about to reorient everything I know around this person, like maybe where I live, what I do, when I wake up in the morning, when I go to bed at night. I mean, so many things, what I eat, right? Um, and if you say yes to that event, then you do collapse a lot of indeterminacy and create a path of determinations for yourself. So I think politically, we have to say, what is it that is not determinate in a sense, right? Like where does potentiality lie? And I think we have to think really radically about this, right? That what does it look like to organize without capital? What does it look like to organize without private property, right? What does that great indeterminate space look like? And if we can say yes to that, if we can say yes to an abolition of private property, like on a very basic level, okay, now let's say yes, and let's collapse all that impossibility and say, okay, now we can start to plot and plan things out, organized around this particular truth that we ought to abolish private property. um, I mean, again, it's kind of like an abstract answer to like the question of praxis, right? But we do need to think abstractly, I think, in order to think concretely, right? And we need to open up that complete open space before we can create a place to have something new. I hope that answers the
Yeah,
question. I
no.
haven't snuck out of it from
This is
something.
the funny thing. So I was just thinking about there's a few funny things sort of that come up in relation to this question. Firstly, this question of what does it mean to think concretely and abstractly and stuff like that. And in some ways, if we are so in terms of we think of the way that capitalism forces us to think abstractly rather than concretely in this A equals A repetitious logic that is actually never um, allowing us to confront the contradictions of reality. Or, as you point out, in terms of the closure of the public space to the private, a form of love relationship to the other or intersubjectivity. But oftentimes, like seeing things for what it is like the most radical thing and the most basic thing. Like obviously Elenka's recent book is about disavowal and how, there is this sort of like, let's say, ideological version of psychoanalysis, which is like the psychoanalyst. You become like a detective unearthing the hidden truth underneath that you didn't see. And this is maybe like a critique I have of like Adam Curtis, but that's not my real critique. I've got other critiques. But like, you think like, I'm going to think about doing a psychoanalysis of this movie. What was going on deep? What are the hidden meanings? When actually it's more about like what's before our very eyes that we refuse to see because we can't confront reality as it is, because that would point to a void that's too traumatic to bear. For example, that the other is lacking like us and I am lacking and I am lacking, therefore I'm a subject, that I am only recognized or misrecognized relative to the division of the other subject. Things like this is really happening, like it is actually really there and it's before our eyes and we can't actually see it. Like everybody will actually die. So why are we not making the most of life as we have it in our finite time? This kind of thing, which is, it sounds like, again, I don't know, not to sound like too self-helpy, but like this is, sometimes when it's like, what do we do about X thing? It's like, well, it is actually, first of all, really happening. this is actually really real. It's not just some thing that we see on our phones that's far away or that we can imagine. We can turn into a commodity of our own. There's a revolution happening somewhere else, and it's, oh, this person is going through this, and poor them, but this is going to change my life in some way. Or it is actually real, and this person is real, like I am real, and we need to do something. So there is this kind of like question of how psychoanalysis, inversely to what is maybe like in like wider culture perceived, about like digging deep rather than seeing what is. Um, but also, so the funny story I have about this, which is it's like totally random, but basically, when I was at high school, at my school, we had to do like cadets, military cadets. I went to like a boarding school, and one summer holiday, I went on this like camp, and there were only two girls, me and this girl, Charlotte, and it was a camp to, we were like learning how to drive tanks in Germany, just like, what the fuck? Anyway, so basically, because there were two girls, there were loads of boys. We had to have a female teacher with us, and our female teacher was this lady called Miss Jones, who's my chemistry teacher at school. And it's funny because, like, in when they did this, it was called CCF, Combined Cadet Force. When they did it on a Monday afternoon, it was like the time when all the staff could like completely like maybe the sadists. I actually have so much, because I taught at a school like this after I was at uni, and I've got such a funny story about the head of the British military at this event where the school is called a tattoo, where they're like, everybody shows off their like little prowess. Maybe I'll save this story for the end of this, because that story is fucking hilarious. So basically, Miss Jones was my chemistry teacher, and we didn't do that much chemistry learning when I was doing what we call our GCSEs when I was 15. We watched lots of documentaries that were sort of prevalent in the noughties about like how crazy people's lifestyles were and how much people ate and this kind of thing. That's like what we watched. Anyway, so but she was the lady who was assigned to take care of us two girls, and she was quite a character, and she had quite a strong regional accent. The other teacher who was with us was a former military person who had organized this camp to basically spend a week with all of his mates who still worked there. And we were sort of left with Miss Jones and some of the, to do some of these activities that we were kind of assigned to do. All the boys were like living in a tent, a big sort of like, it was like a massive long tent in just outside. And we were in a shower block. It was me on these little like camp beds, me, Charlotte, and Miss Jones. And in the middle of the night, one night, there was a massive storm. And the big tent had these like strobe lights that were like, used to, but it was all sort of like wired badly or whatever. And in the middle of the night, one of the lights had collapsed on the ground into this big puddle, and there'd been an explosion, an electrical explosion. And in the morning, the boys were like, Miss Jones, what do we do? What do we do? And Miss Jones said, act accordingly. And she, in her strong voice, said, act accordingly, which was sort of at the time everyone found really funny, because you're like, this means nothing. And so basically, at the end of the week, you always had to do this like overnight exercise where you'd have to like pretend to do this attack at dawn or whatever, and like sleep in a field. And you'd have everybody in this sort of like enclosed area, and every hour people would be on sentry duty and like exchange the sentry duty. And you'd have like a phrase, you have a 2-word password challenge where somebody says the word and then the person says the receiving word, and you know that they're like one of the goodies. So we obviously chose act accordingly. And so like I've always sort of thought this accordingly, or act accordingly, or think accordingly, in the perpetual unfolding of the moment, with its ever-present lack and contradiction, its infinite possibility, we are always invited to act accordingly. And I think, in a sense, this is like the concrete rather than the abstract. But of course, as you say, like we have to often think abstractly to think concretely. But I sort of think about Miss Jones in terms of these moments. It's like, in a sense, what if we don't have recourse to any other explication other than the moment that surrounds us? in the way it presents itself to us now. And I think about politically, like the rehashing, like with Trump, the rehashing of previous attempts to mitigate against the excesses of whatever in previous orders of things, or the recycling of emancipatory tropes in the 21st century that were very relevant in the 20th, but actually lead to our greater ensnarement in capital through a confidence of critique. There's always this need, this sort of like step zero before the 12 steps, like I am an actual alcoholic, I'm a divided subject, I live in a divided world, where we can't turn, we have to think according to our moment in the way that like the gestalt of it all presents itself to us. And that's very disorientating and scary. And it's also the reason why we all found it so hilarious that this woman who knew nothing about what she was doing said that phrase. It's like the most useful phrase. It answers everything and it also says nothing. But yeah,
Helen, I love it. It's like so brilliant, actually. What was her name, the teacher
Miss
again?
Jones.
Okay,
Miss
Miss Jones nails it,
She
right?
nails
Like
it. She nails it.
completely nails it for me. And I think, gosh, even the AA thing is hilarious, right? Because you have to first start by like naming the truth, right? Which is
Yeah.
disorienting before you can have all these other sort of like productive steps come from fidelity to that truth event, right? That, one is an alcoholic. But yeah, I think act accordingly is great because like you said, well, what are we acting according to? And it's precisely that like unnameable real that happened to you guys, right? That these lights fell and an explosion happened. I mean, what a better like visual of like an impossible becoming possible. Like there's a little explosion, right? Like this unnameable real that I don't even know what happened. It's just that something happened. Act accordingly, right? To
Yeah.
the truth event, right? To that impossibility that has been placed. And this is, this is part of, I really like this part of Badiou's theory of the event, which again, to me has a really nice connection to Lacan as well, that when the impossibility happens and we name it, well, now we've introduced a new term into the situation, but it bears the trace of unnameability as well. It's always split in this way, the event. It's split between the impossible that I can't ever name, and yet I give it a name anyway. I call it the storming of the Bastille. I call it I love you. I call it falling in love. I call it the lights fell into the puddle. That doesn't really capture what kind of the shock and overthrowing of your little symbolic in the cadet training world that happened to you, right? Like, oh, this is not what's supposed to happen in the symbolic that we've constructed, right? So I think that the trace of the impossible that is always present in that new signifier that we introduce, like this is what Badiou says, but it's so similar to introducing a new S1 into a situation. And I think just to like tie it back to space, the way I see this happening, right, is that we have every time we name an event like this, like with the lights falling into the puddle or with a political event, we're placing two things. We're placing both the one and the void, and we're
Mhm.
placing them in the same place. And
Yeah.
that's like the negation of negation, right? This is like the double twist of impossibility, right? Where I say, I'm going to name that event, that love event, the political event, even just these lights falling, which ruptured this symbolic in some way, right? I'm naming that as one, I'm counting it as one. And in doing so, I'm suturing the impossible to it, right? I'm suturing the void that isn't nameable, that love can be real. I mean, this is an impossibility, right? That there is a political event, that these lights fell. And this cut within the name itself, this is difference. This is introducing a two into a situation, introducing a split into what was otherwise an indifferent situation. Otherwise, it's just you're indifferent. The training of the cadets, right? This is just kind of like, every day, as it goes, right? Or without the love event, without the political event, it's the indifference as such. And so introducing that split, placing both the one and the void on top of each other in this way, right? That's in a Lacanian sense, right? That's like localizing the real, right? That's putting a new S1 into a particular place and saying, okay, now I can reorganize around that. And it's actually kind of really beautiful, the story you told, because it seems like from that like differentiating moment, all of you as like young cadets could then really connect to each other, right? Could
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
maybe we were a bit indifferent towards each other before. I had me and Charlotte, I had, the two girls, Mrs. Jones, and then a bunch of boys, right? But now we all have something that we have in common, which is precisely this kind of radical difference, right? This, and we have a name for it. We have signifiers, act accordingly, and now we have camaraderie, and it's actually a really great example, I think, in that way that
Yeah.
has so many implications.
No, it's interesting as well because I kind of just talking to what you just said and kind of going back on what I said, but also doubling down on it, the contradiction in terms, is that in terms of act accordingly, right? And this like um, confrontation of the infinite possibility of the like emancipatory moment, the contradictory moment, the gestalt of how it presents itself to us in all its novelty. There is also something that is um, so both like the infinite possibility and like ontologically the same, right? And I think this is the same thing in terms of like what Todd and others talk about in terms of, the only thing that we share is what we don't share. So in some ways, yes, to reiterate what I said, there is no knowing in this moment what the relevant act is. But there is also a foundational truth or um, like, I don't know what the word is, can't think of the word, but like an always correct approach, which is to do with the fact that there are basic premises of our reality that are true. So like that the other person exists, right? That like as you say, like naming you are an alcoholic. This is a truth that you've come to. It's not like, and obviously that like approaching the contradiction of the moment and the gestalt of the moment, everything presenting it to you itself to you as like a truth that should be named, but also by saying, well, we don't know, the 21st century is different from the 20th. There is also this through line in terms of like, I do think that Marx is more relevant than ever. And we need greater fidelity to Marx to actually come up with a reading of how the materialism that he was pointing to in terms of the material structure of capitalism is playing out today. So the difference and the sameness. So, in terms of, let's just say, what do we do about X or Y conflict? Well, okay, we can't say it's the same as this conflict or it's the same as what we did in this era or that Trump should have his tariffs or whatever. There's this moment and then the continuum of truth is not categorizable in terms of um, something that is just replicated over and over, but is like an ontological truth that sort of transcends the signifier in a way, which is, firstly, like there's human beings involved, that there is always lack involved, that there are certain ways that because of, let's say, politics occurs inevitably, or the need for a form of politics, or a theologizing of an attempt to mitigate against politics through magical thinking, when two or more people are living in community and there are resources that need to be shared, or there's a difference of desire, or there's a difference of subjectivity. These are truths that do exist, that we can maybe have as like a basic premise roadmap. And I do, because what I sort of worry about is that often in terms of like a reactive logic, and it's not surprising that people become more reactionary. I mean, this is just like meted out throughout history, the more precarious they feel. But, this sort of how signifiers that assure us that they are radical become the very thing that are de-radicalizing and are conservative. So but there are things like if you say if you're not with me you're against me, or there's a special place in hell for this, but this person is this, I know that if you say this signifier you're X type of person or whatever, and this can be embodied as an apparently radical thing precisely because it like shares superficial signs with a moment in history where those signs pointed to something else, but foundationally the like structure of that logic is reactionary. And let's say we turned back history to Cardinal Richelieu and the burning of witches, this is like manifestly reactionary in this period of time. So, in a sense, it's having like a fidelity to a structure of logic that embraces the difference of the other, the sameness of the difference of the other in terms of we are all structured by lack, and this explodes in an infinite number of directions in its manifest form. But in terms of like the underlying ontology of subjectivity, it's that needs to be borne in mind as a continuum. So I guess the point is like we need both a fidelity to certain truths of reality, and this maybe offers a roadmap in a certain sense, but also an openness to the infinite possibility of lack, contradiction, of surprise, of conversion, that we could be wrong. So maybe there is like this is like a, I don't know if it's, you'd call it praxis, but it's a an orientation relative to truth and novelty, or relative to something existing in some potentiality. And we can kind
Completely.
of think about these things or know some of it, not know all of it. But yeah, I don't know.
No, I love that. I think that's such a great way to think about praxis as an orientation towards a truth. What
Hmm.
else are we building if we're
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
orienting ourselves towards a truth? What is being built,
Yeah.
right? If there's not some stake in the ground around which we're focusing our efforts, right? And I think this, what you bring up, the like the infinite possibility that unfolds in the present. I mean, I think it's something really to like sit with, right? Because I mean, on the one hand, right, if we buy into the discourse on the end of history, which I think one should take with a certain grade of salt, right? But at the same time, I think there's a lot to learn from this. The present has collapsed with the future, right? And we can't think a new future because we live in the future and the future's already arrived and we're already doomed to climate change
Yeah.
into so many other disasters, right? We are already kind of consigned in this way. So I think, part of the contemporary question of emancipation is how to really divorce the present from the future, right? And to say, no, we don't already live in the future. Or, I mean, this is, like Frank Ruda's like fatalistic, outlook is to say the future is already ruined. We already lost, the apocalypse has already happened. Now can we really start
Yeah.
to rethink, right? But just to like, dwell a bit more on this question of like the infinite unfolding of possibility in the moment, I think it's something to really think about because on the one hand, we could just like read the first pages of the phenomenology and say, well, Hegel tells us that the now is impossible, right? Like, why even think about this now? Is there really an infinite unfolding of possibility if I can never localize a now? Or should we twist that screw once further and say, well, what's really impossible about the now? And one way I think to look at this is that per Hegel, right, the now is impossible because every now is homogeneous with every other now. They're all the same nows. And, I mean, time is such a big question in Hegel, and there's been so much scholarship on time. But just to reference one particular place where Hegel talks about time, in Philosophy of Nature, a naturalistic time for Hegel is just a different like space,
Mhm.
homogeneous, continuous. And we can think about this, right? Time in nature.
Mhm.
Nature has no events, nature has no history, right? Time is just chronos. It just indifferently destroys and creates. It's only once we start to logically organize time as spirited beings, right? And these are the three Hegelian registers, right? If we read the Encyclopedia, Logic, Nature, and Spirit, if we start to logically organize time as spirited beings, we start to introduce a difference into the homogeneity of time, right? And, like, as you know, right, like every time there's a great political event, we reorganize time,
Mhm.
right? With a
Yeah,
love
absolutely.
event, we reorganize time. So I think the phrasing that you're using is really compelling, the infinite possibility of the moment, because there's precisely this contradiction between the homogeneity of the moment or the possibility to reorganize time and
Yeah,
rethink time in this way and introduce that cut of difference, that void into the blank homogeneity. That's negation of negation, right?
absolutely. Because you're absolutely right in terms of like what even is now. Is it just a haunting that isn't concretely ever here? As in, well, it's interesting because I have like a real dislike for a lot of film theory. And there's one theorist who wrote about film as 24 deaths a second, but she also wrote this other essay that really Anyway, won't get into it. But anyway, but this idea of like, film as this like repetitious death, as in the capture of the frames or whatever.
Mm.
And in terms of like what Frank's saying about the apocalypse, or let's say death, right? Like I'm very like drawn by this idea that the apocalypse isn't coming, it's already happened. And that is our entrance into subjectivity. Like we're already dead. And it's only in die as in losing everything, or the experience of everything as we enter subjectivity, that we get everything back in a different way. But it is haunted by the death that we experience as substantive, but it is only loss relative to something that we experience that we don't have. So, as in like we lose the utopia of the breast or the womb, whatever, but it's only become something substantive, quote unquote, insofar as it's lost. So the death itself is the animating thing. So yeah, as you say, like, and this is where like I say, I don't know, I kind of lie, because I am like also like quite a depressive person, but like I'm so positive about life, because lack is not lack. Lack is the generative force of life, of the experience of the animation of life. Like, so the imminent, we experience life as transcendent precisely because it isn't. But yeah, that now in its unfolding, whatever now is, only exists because it doesn't, or it cannot, or because we are dead to it, or we are only able to experience it because we're already dead. I don't know. So there is this kind of like the AA thing, like we've already lost,
Mhm.
right? So, but this is something that capitalism is in denial of, as in we can overcome this thing that makes everything possible, worthwhile, experienced, etc. But yeah, the potentiality of the moment is only a gift given to us through death, basically.
Completely. And I
Yeah,
think like I'm always kind of I share your same kind of like struggle with like pessimism and optimism, like as a thinker, because the way to optimism is through pessimism,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
This is, I
exactly.
think, like, Savoy's point, and I think Frank's point as well, right? But, to bring up Todd again, right? Like, what we have in common is our alienation, right? And what you are saying as well, what we have in common is our finitude, our death, right? Through which we can, in a Hegelian sense, think about like an infinite or an eternal spirit. Um, but what we have in common, I mean, really strictly is emptiness, is the void, is lack. But if I were to be an optimist in this situation, I would say, but that emptiness is precisely the promise of potentiality. It is the promise of freedom. We need space to be free. And having that thing that hasn't been determined, that emptiness, almost overdetermined in its emptiness,
Yeah,
right, is nonetheless the very possibility for emancipation, that we have nothing literally in
yeah,
common.
absolutely. No, it's funny because I have seen that I actually defended Todd on this. I fucking hate Facebook. I committed Facebook suicide in 2009 over a fight about a Katy Perry lyric. And then I had to get
Oh,
Facebook
yeah.
because I was making this documentary about like um, older Christians in America, and the interviewees were to be found on Facebook. So I set up Facebook. And then I kind of like all the philosophy people are on Facebook. Anyway, Facebook, it obviously just encourages reactionary thinking, whatever. And somebody was having a go at Todd for writing self-help. Because again,
Mm.
as soon as you talk about emancipation, freedom, they're talking about like how the Ljubljana school, as soon as you talk about emancipation, this is just self. It's like, well, no, there's a dialectic here, just because it is only insofar as we are entirely limited, um, that we have nothing in common, nothing itself. So there's oh my God, there's a little linguistic game you can play when you get into this conversation about nothing, and it's sort of like, haha.
Mhm.
Um, so what is it? Nothing.
I mean, precisely that. I mean, like, does the nothing exist, right?
Yeah.
Like, is there nothing in common, or as in, like,
Yeah.
there's zero, less than nothing, haha, in this, Jackian way, right? Or is that nothingness itself a point of common orientation, right?
Well, linguistically, I think like language proves nothing is absolute. Right. So, it's like, thanks, language, but the point being is it's like, so it's the same in psychoanalysis. It's like psychoanalysis only works. And it's so many writers have said this in terms of replace Christianity with any belief system. Okay, so only a Christian can be an atheist. It's only insofar as you lurch towards freedom or um, the possibility to be emancipated that you can actually confront the dialectic or the gaping hole of this attempt at emancipation. And it's only in the embrace of this attempted hole that you might get something emancipatory. So it's like a dialectic. It's a promise to be confronted with the temple curtain ripping and having zero emancipation, but that zero being the possibility of building the potential of anything remotely emancipatory. So like psychoanalysis itself relies on the fallacy that people believe it's going to help them, that it is self-help. This is transference. You would not waste all your money or like go and try to do it without the belief that this person could give you something. So when people, when this guy was critiquing Todd for self-help, I'm like, yeah, and that's a good thing, Orientate yourself, go after it, believe in it, but it's only in really giving yourself over to the belief that you will confront the abject horror of this impossibility. But in that positioning yourself gradually through transference, countertransference, and embracing of this impossibility, that then you can have some. So it's like, you like a sort of a naysayer standing at the sideline being like, oh, you can't have that. And it's like, well, in a sense, all we have is giving it a go in a deluded way, this constant negotiation and, of transference, countertransference, belief, disbelief, remembering, forgetting, remembering, lack, forgetting, lack. And yet again, like the critique itself is not enough. It's like, so what? Okay, self-help's bad. Yeah, I agree. It's like the new atheist. You're like, okay, God doesn't. Yeah, okay. So what about the experience of God? What about the drive towards God? What about drive as such? What about the structure of subjectivity? What about lack as ontology? But yeah, do you have any kind of closing thoughts? I thought maybe I should tell the story about the head of the military and this second cadet story. But I'm just going to see if we like answered all because there were some questions we had in advance. So we've talked about theories based. We didn't talk about like the good and bad infinite, but maybe we
Yeah,
can.
let's do it on the next
Let's do
episode,
it on the
But
next.
I want to hear the military story.
So, you know how weird life is?
Yes.
And I'm always sort of thinking about like, how did there's a this song with the line that's like, how did I? And I ask myself, how did I get it? I'm always
Mhm.
thinking about this. It's like, what? What the hell? But anyway, so after uni, I ended up teaching at this school. It's quite a well-known all boys boarding school for various different reasons, mostly because I wanted out of like the path towards academia that I was on at the time. Anyway, so I ended up teaching at the school, but I only stayed there for 2 years. I was there from 22 to 24, and it was like such a weird and interesting and traumatizing and rich and horrible and whatever experience, but I won't get into it. And also, you know, it is what it is. And lots of people there were really interesting and fantastic, and it was like a weird institution, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, basically, they had this event every summer called the 4th of June, where the parents come, it's like an open day. And the open day opens the night before. With a military tattoo, right? So all these schools, they're kind of like historic British schools or whatever, and the students are encouraged to participate in this combined cadet force. And this school is not like any other school. The school is like hyper school. So, it wasn't just like some kids, because they're basically showing off like what they've done in the year. And they have the head of the army come and like witness and sign off on their tattoo. So it's not just like anything. And you have kids like literally landing helicopters in the
Wow.
school, the playing field where they're doing this, whatever. And basically the school is in a small kind of enclave of this bigger town where one of the royal residences are, and where a lot of the cavalry regiments, which are, there's different types, but there's ones that do this sort of, they're like all the royal shit. And basically, the stupid prancing around. And basically the horses, when they retire, they kind of keep them on, and they're sort of old or whatever, and then the kids get to use them for their like pretend army. So they had these uh, really old, like fat horses that they were doing their horse, like a dressage thing where they're in the military gear and they're doing this like da 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 da. And basically, and the funny thing is like I actually subsequently met two members of this band, um, which is just also another weird way that life works. But basically, the song, um, they were doing this like horse prancing rhythmically, da 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 da, look at us do our little horsey twirl on these weird fat horses, to the only songs. And I really don't think this was ironic, but this is again like the residue of the real, right? The return of the repressed. Because knowing the colleagues that were involved in like being the teachers of the CCF, either somebody had a great sense of irony or like no taste and really no sense of irony. And I think it was probably the latter. But basically, they found like the only two contemporary pop songs they could find with the word horse in it. And the first one was like a Natasha Bedingfield song, which is something about like wild horses or whatever. And they're like, and
Hmm.
it's so incongruous. They have the pop music and they're doing the, and then the second song, and there were like hundreds of people here, like dignitaries, old people, the head of the army in their stupid uniform. And it was the Scissor Sisters, Only the Horses, right? This song is the gayest song you've ever heard. You can see it's from 2012. You can listen to it on YouTube, and oh my God, it was these like crazy horses, all these boys in their military uniform, this Scissor Sisters song blaring out. And I was just like, what the fuck am I watching? Where am I? What is this? Um, but yeah, no, it's an extremely camp song. And either I say I don't think the teacher was doing it with any sense of irony, which made it even more funny.
This is the return of the real.
This song is like do 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 do, just like oh my God, how embarrassing. But
I
yeah,
mean, the unconscious shouts, right?
no, it really does.
Shout.
Oh my God, oh my God, yeah. And if you kind of knew
Oh.
it was going, yeah. Anyway, that's a long story, but we find ourselves in these weird places in our life.
I mean, no, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's so funny because it does strike me as, yeah, the return of the repressed or the unconscious, shouting in these different ways. It's really when things alert us in their awkwardness, right? That the symbolic is sort of being jiggled up a little bit, right? Where we're rattling at the bars of the symbolic when such awkwardness comes to the fore, right? There is some latent truth beneath this event, it seems like.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I know these kind of like attempted conservative, like like the libido's always there, the kind of carnivalesque is always there. Yeah, ready to, I don't know, overthrow the whole thing. But yeah, no, it's quite fun. Have you ever seen the movie If? So
I
in
haven't.
1960s, oh, it's a really brilliant 1967 movie about kids at one of these repressive boarding schools where the CCF kids overthrow, like do a revolution, start,
Hmm.
like they overthrow the school. It's very so it's very funny, but this was like this sort of weird 2012, I think this was, no, it's 2013 version of If with the kind of
Because that is what's repressed, right? That you can, overthrow the system, right? That
yeah,
beneath all of the military discipline is the
yeah,
ability for insurrection and I mean the most obvious level of like repressing the homoerotic within
uh-huh.
the confines of the military. I mean, there's so many examples, right? That one has to repress the latent homoeroticism and then it erupts in so many interesting and poignant ways. Just a simple song can like trigger a thousand,
Absolutely.
a thousand laughters will bloom.
Exactly. But I was sort of thinking like, I don't know if people are finding this as funny as me, but it's funny because as well, like the word scissor sister obviously is like lesbian, right? So it was like the little pamphlet thing. It's like this is accompanied by the song. Like people are doing very well at keeping a straight face here. But oh my God. Anyway, but it's been great to chat, and we should do it another time. I mean, I feel like Hegel is such a um yeah, I mean, obviously we could talk about it forever.
Yeah, no, Helen, thank you so much. I mean, I think like I mentioned to you before, thinking about space in terms of politics was really an exciting moment for me to like ask, okay, how does this work on really like sort of like ontological space as I've been sort of rendering it have its more political implications? And it was, I mean, it was a really rich conversation for me. I loved developing these ideas and talking with you as always. It's such a rich conversation. I mean, thank you so much.
Not
It's
at
always
all.
such a pleasure.
I hope people enjoyed it. I mean, it's funny because again, like I feel like, um, yeah, maybe there's so much more to say. And it's kind of sometimes quite hard to like concretize some of these things because again, then things become prescriptive or whatever. And then it's like, yeah, no, but I really, when you came and gave your talk on space, I was just like, oh, this is it left me with so many kind of percolating things that I wanted to chat to you about. So yeah, thanks so much.
Do it again soon.
Let's do it again
Thank you,
soon.
Helen.
Okay. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. And yeah, we'll put this up on our website. How exciting. Okay. Thanks, guys.